I'm so glad to have back on the podcast Associate Professor Fadhel Kaboub from Denison, who is one of the best communicators, particularly with respect to talking about the economy that I know. Welcome back to the podcast, Professor.
Thanks for having me back. It's a pleasure to be here.
Okay, so this time I have a pretty narrow question that I want to tackle first and foremost. I spoke recently to Professor Wolff, and he raised the idea of price controls to help address inflation, which is all anybody's really talking about. I mean, that and the Supreme Court, but we're going to table that for a second. And, a lot of the pushback that I heard after that episode and after bringing it up in other contexts was, Nixon's price controls were a failure. I have an article here titled "Nixon Knew His Price Controls Wouldn't Work." And it goes through some of the dialogue from the Nixon tapes where he's saying things like, here's my concern about the freeze. There's a strong support for a wage board and wage price controls, and particularly from sources like Arthur Burns. The difficulty with wage price controls and a wage board, as you know, is that the goddamn things will not work. They did not work at the end of World War II. They will never work in peacetime. But the article goes on to explain that he decided to do it for political reasons because they were overwhelmingly popular. And here's some commentary from the Cato Institute. If you notice the theme of the commentary, it tends to be from conservative sources. And that's why I wanted to talk to you to get perhaps a more objective gloss on what the criticisms here are and what we should be pushing for. But this from the Cato Institute says, there was no national emergency in the summer of 71. Unemployment stood at 6%. Inflation only a point higher than it was now. This is an article from 2011. Yet after Nixon's announcement, the markets rallied, the press swooned, and even though his speech preempted the popular Western bonanza, the people loved it too. 75% backed the plan in polls. So it went on to say it was ultimately an utter failure. Ranchers stopped shipping their cattle to the market. Farmers drowned their chickens, and consumers emptied the shelves of supermarkets. But it did boost him in the polls in the shorter term. So how should we think about this? Is it in fact something that's doomed to failure, or could it be saved by a different kind of implementation?
Very good question. So let's start with the original statement, which is Nixon's price controls were a failure. Well, the correct statement there is that Nixon was a failure, period, across the board. So the issue here, the underlying issue is really inflation, and how do we tame inflation? And one of the first kind of intuitions is that, well, the powerful president or government should control prices, right? The question is, do you know what you're controlling? Do you know the underlying forces that actually create the pressure points? Do you know where the inflation pressure points come from? And now once you control them, how do you unwind the controls? Because you're kind of squeezing something down and you're holding on to that power and squeezing it for a year, 2 or 3. And then once you release, you get that explosion, right? And this is really what happened during the Nixon times and especially during World War II, because World War II was the actual more successful experience with price controls. But releasing those prices after the war was the part where there was a little bit of mismanagement. So let's start with our world today. What are the inflation pressure points that we have in the U.S. economy and globally? Let's start just with the U.S. We have to understand that there were inflation pressure points pre-pandemic that we haven't dealt with. And then we had the pandemic disruptions to global supply chains that created this global traffic jam and shortages and delays of key inputs related to the pandemic. And then, of course, more recently, we have the conflict in the Ukraine that added even more inflation pressure points related to energy prices, related to food prices globally, and related to key inputs, industrial inputs, minerals, especially coming out of Russia. So we have these 3 components of inflation pressure points that we need to deal with. Let's start with pre-pandemic. And this is really where the focus on the US and the public discourse in the US is very important. Pre-pandemic, we had 4 inflation pressure points that most Americans recognize. Number 1, we have inflation pressure points related to healthcare. Number 2, energy and transportation. Number 3, real estate, housing. And number 4, higher education. These are the inflation pressure points that we've ignored. And of course, they become more compounded with the effects of the pandemic and the effects of the Ukraine and Russia conflict. So how do we detect inflation pressure points? It's typically 2 components that reflect a particular inflation pressure point. Number 1 is a lack of productive capacity. In other words, shortage of productive capacity of skilled workers, of technology, of materials. And sometimes it's done intentionally by the industry to create artificial scarcity, to control the price, to control the market. And one way to deal with lack of productive capacity is to produce more of it. And that has to do with government regulation, incentives, and abusive market power in some cases. So on the energy front, and this is why the Green New Deal movement, the MMT movement for a number of years leading up to the pandemic, we've been saying we need to decarbonize the system. We need to democratize the energy production system, decentralize the grid, and so on. And that's one way to relieve that inflation pressure point and reduce the abusive market power of a particular industry. The healthcare, that's why we've been advocating for Medicare for all, to make the system more inclusive, to lower the cost, and to increase the productive capacity of the industry. In other words, train more doctors and nurses and technicians, build more capacity to treat a lot of the people who have been excluded from the healthcare system, the working class and lower income communities. So this is how you go about addressing these. Number 1, add more productive capacity. Number 2, tax and regulate abusive price setters in each industry. So you democratize those industries. In other words, you make them more inclusive, and you lower the cost, and you make them more accessible.
Can I ask what is perhaps an overly pedantic question?
Go ahead, please.
There's a part of me that my brain wants to just fully accept, these sectors, which happen to be sectors from a policy perspective that I want to be reformed anyway, regardless of them being drivers of inflation or inflation pressure points. My brain wants to accept, yes, this is what needs to be fixed. It's right in line with my own ideology. But I don't necessarily, I think, fully understand how it is that, let's say, the fact of healthcare costs being high or education costs being high ultimately results in prices across the board, food costs, for instance, gas costs. I mean, I know that has some geopolitical drivers, but all these other kind of costs that we in total call inflation broadly, how does that drive the other? Because also all of those costs in those areas, transportation, education, healthcare, et cetera, have been high for a long time, even before we've gotten into this inflationary spike.
Sure. So a couple of things. Let's pick higher education as an example, because it's really an interesting. It's not because the higher education industry is so powerful, it's like a cartel of universities trying to dominate the market. It's actually a recipient of inflation pressure points and other policy failures at the national level that creates that high cost of higher education. If you go back, 3-4 decades, what we started with was states at the state level reducing their contribution to state universities and colleges, public colleges. As a result, to stay in business, they had to raise the tuition. So now you raise the tuition, you make it more expensive, but at the same time, thanks to financial deregulation and Wall Street, coming to help, you provide student loans so that you make it, you make the pain less painful, so to speak, for students to go through college. But at the same time, those public universities and colleges now open the floodgate for private universities to also raise their tuition, because it's a competition type of system. But then to justify why you're charging so much and why college is so expensive, you have to provide the infrastructure for it. So better quality dorms and lazy rivers and swimming pools and gyms. And so you increase the cost of actually operating a university. So now what are the costs that actually create the additional pressure points at the university level? It's cost of healthcare, because it's an input for all the faculty and staff and so on. Cost of heating and cooling and operating the buildings. So the inflation pressures from the energy system, cost of construction, which also includes cost of healthcare, cost of energy, cost of raw materials, which is another inflation pressure point. So you end up with energy, transportation, healthcare, and real estate being additional pressure points that create the higher education inflation pressure point. And thanks to, the neoliberal policies of the last 40 years, when you reduce the state contribution to public universities, you force them to raise the cost, and you open the floodgate for private universities to do the same. And Wall Street comes in and says, well, here's your student loans. Don't worry about it for now. Just go through education and then pay for it for the rest of your adult life, essentially for hundreds of thousands of students who end up pretty much most of their career paying student loans, and hence the student loan
millions.
crisis. Millions, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So this is how kind of the price system, you have to recognize that it's a very multifaceted, interlocking, complex system. So when it comes to your original question about price controls, which part of the price system are you going to control? Are you going to control the final price? Or are you going to control the underlying mechanisms? Or are you going to control all prices from the beginning to end? So that's why it's such a complicated policy choice to go after price controls without understanding where the sources of inflation come from and where the lack of productive capacity emanates from and where the abuse of market power is. Is it at the local gas station? It's not the local gas station that's price gouging you. It's a whole mechanism of oil and gas industry and middlemen and corporate abuse at the national and international level that determines the final price. It's not your local neighborhood gas station that's dominating the global economy, of course. So where do you start the controls, and what are the mechanisms that you introduce? Is it actually fixing the price, or is it going after the abusers and determining rules and regulations that limit their influence in the price system? That becomes the wonky type of discussion that we're not having right now, that the Nixon administration didn't care to have. But the administration that we had during World War II was very careful about. Where they failed at the time was in releasing the price controls at the end of after World War II and kind of unleashing the pent-up demand that came after the war for consumer goods, and not having prepared the productive capacity to deal with the massive increase in demand for consumer goods in particular after World War II. So these are the kind of the details that economists need to be paying attention to, policymakers need to be paying attention to, but also progressives who are calling for price controls need to articulate to the public, to policymakers, why we have to be careful with these things. I'm not saying we shouldn't have price controls. I'm saying we need to understand the price mechanism so that we're not kind of introducing price controls and then causing more problems and then having this backfire on us and say, well, look, we told you price controls don't work.
So you just mentioned kind of a choice between, and maybe they're not mutually exclusive, implementing price controls or going after the price gougers. And there has been some conversation about going after price gougers, which has also been poo-pooed by conservatives, and including some conservative Democrats who think this is one of Bernie's peccadillos. Like he thinks, all he has is a class war hammer and everything looks like a class war nail. And so that's, they're very dismissive of it for those reasons. Is it a one or another? And if not, do you prefer kind of one approach over another?
So price gougers take advantage of a situation when there is shortages, when there's panic buying, when they have sort of an exclusive privilege in an industry, whether geographically or at the national level. So how do you deal with them? Dealing with the price gouging per se, it doesn't eliminate the fact that there are shortages of actual production. Doesn't eliminate the fact that that price gouger has an exclusive privilege and doesn't have competition. So the best way to deal with it is to do all the above. Create alternatives, increase competition, increase productive capacity, and regulate the abusive market power, the fact that those entities have exclusive privilege that they've accumulated over time by eliminating the competition, sometimes with the help of federal regulation or federal deregulation, I should say. So going after the price gouging issue from a one-sided perspective doesn't help us either, because it perpetuates the problem in some cases. I'll give you an example. The hyperinflation in Zimbabwe. A lot of people say, well, hyperinflation, government printing too much money and all that. It didn't actually start with government printing too much money. It started with the government trying to redistribute land away from a white colonial minority to kind of the masses, so to speak. But it was done in a corrupt way, in a way that allowed the president to give large blocks of farmland, very fertile, productive farmland, to individuals who had nothing to do with agriculture, were not interested in producing food. They were just, allies of the president. So what happened? Yeah, food production dropped by something like 50%. So you actually have food shortage. Well, prices, of course, will increase when you have food shortage. Well, what happened next? In order to allow the elites and the especially military and national security officers to have enough income to actually buy food for themselves and their families, the government started paying them more. So now you've given a small group of powerful elite individuals extra cash to go to the same market, which has a shortage, to outbid everybody else and drive up the price even more. And that immediately created a scenario where, any entrepreneurial individual will get on a truck, cross the border to South Africa, buy cheaper food, cheaper gasoline, cheaper medicine, and bring it across the border and sell it at a premium. But to do that, you have to bribe the border controls, the military, the police. And within a matter of days, you have an armed cartel of traffickers with police and military and armed individuals controlling the marketplace. And now their exclusive privilege of that abusive power and armed power is to keep the inflation system in place, because otherwise they have no advantage of buying stuff from South Africa at a lower cost and selling it at a premium. And that started to spiral into the hyperinflation thing. It had nothing to do with government deficits or spending. So price controls in that system literally means, number one, producing more food locally, and number two, dealing with the corruption, dealing with the armed cartels that traffic across borders. Yeah. So every time you think about price controls, you have to try to figure out, where is the inflation pressure point? Who are the key players controlling that inflation mechanism, and going at the source so that you don't have to control every single purchase and every single price in an entire economy, which is a nightmare in terms of controlling, the price of everything. So we have to be careful here in the US and start with the inflation pressure points. As I said earlier, pre-pandemic inflation pressure points, pandemic disruptions, and the conflict in the Ukraine.
So how are we dealing? Yeah, go ahead.
Well, no, I was saying.
Go ahead. No, you please go ahead.
I was saying, how are we dealing with it in the U.S. right now in terms of actual policy administration? We have Congress saying we need to reduce spending because they're blaming the inflation on too much spending on pandemic relief, on poor children, on supporting the unemployed, and so on. And number two, Congress is saying, well, inflation is in the hands of the Fed, so the Fed should deal with it. And what does the Fed do? They raise interest rates, as if higher interest rates are going to end the conflict in the Ukraine, as if higher interest rates are going to end the pandemic supply chain disruption, as if higher interest rates are going to deal with the abusive market power of Big Pharma or Wall Street or big tech or real estate companies. It's got nothing to do with it. But what it's going to do, higher interest rate is going to cause a debt crisis at the global level because they're raising interest rates across the world. It's going to cause a financial crisis in the US. There's no such thing as soft landing. There's going to be a hard landing with balance sheets that have massive amounts of debt, corporations, individuals. Higher interest rates will cause the problem. And it's going to make the system move towards a recession and create more unemployment, because now an unemployed individual can't buy a washing machine and can't buy a new car and can't buy XYZ. So it's going to reduce the demand by causing unemployment. So it's going to force us into a recession without actually dealing with the inflation problem. So inflation will remain high as long as there's a conflict in the Ukraine, as long as we have all of the abusive market power in the system. So we end up with high unemployment and high inflation. That's what we call stagflation.
So why? I don't understand why they're pursuing this pathway. For one, politically, it's a disaster to get up in front of the American people and say, hey guys, the goal is to raise unemployment. Like, that's disastrous. And then secondly, from an efficacy perspective, as you've just laid out, they have to know on some level that it doesn't work and can lead to stagflation.
Yeah.
So what do you think is driving this approach?
It's ideology. It's very clear. If you look at the Bank for International Settlement report that came out a few days ago, and the language that all major central bankers are using, the Fed, the ECB, the Bank of England, they're saying it in a sort of softer tone. They're saying, well, we don't want to create mass unemployment, but we have to slow down the economy just a tiny bit and create sort of a soft landing instead of crashing the economy. And the BIS report, the Bank for International Settlement, said, we're running the risk of going into a high-level global inflation for a long period. And what central banks around the world need to do immediately is crack down on that inflation by raising interest rates very aggressively so that we can avoid that high inflation cycle. And when they say that, they're very clear about what very aggressively going after inflation, meaning causing a recession, slowing down their economy. Slowing down economy is code word for creating unemployment. They know this very clearly. So why do I say this is ideological? Because the other option, instead of raising interest rates, is actually going after the actual sources of inflation, which is taxing and regulating abusive market power and spending more. In other words, creating more jobs in strategic areas of the economy to increase productive capacity in energy and transportation and healthcare. In other words, what's this thing? What do we call it? A Green New Deal, which is what you do when you increase spending carefully in strategic areas to decarbonize the system, to build public transportation, higher education, healthcare system, and go after the abusive market power of corporations. That completely resets the system from a power structure. And they're not interested in this.
But it's just, so when I had Professor Wolff on, he made the point that, like, he went to school with Janet Yellen. Like, they learned the same things and read the same books. It just, I don't know if this is just a me problem and I am insufficiently red pilled and I'm still trying to make sense of things I shouldn't be trying to make sense of. But politically, again, going after price gougers, it's hard to see a downside. If you're telling me that the reason that they don't want to pursue that kind of strategy is because their entire campaigns have been funded by the very industries that they would have to be going after, that's an explanation that I understand very well and can accept. But on some level, when you pair the rhetoric coming out of the Democratic Party about how desperate they are about midterms and how it's about to be a bloodbath and how they're going to fall out of power for a generation, and look at the opportunity that this economic situation and pandemic have presented to them to do what Democrats are stereotyped as wanting to do and have said at points in times that they want to do, which is spin, spin, spin. It seems just, it's hard for me to wrap my brain around. Okay, maybe they're not going to do a big FDR style price control. Maybe they're not going to say we're going to go full blown Green New Deal because of the oil crisis and people's brains not being able to accept those two things at once. But the idea of going after the four meat companies that make all the meat in America and say you're price gouging, or some of these other industries, or say we're gonna build 2 new baby formula factories by the fall, just something.
Yeah, well, the corporations that control strategic markets, if you attempt to go after them and you're not actually prepared to deal with the consequences politically and economically, the first thing they're going to do is they're going to turn the public against you by creating a crisis. So they will artificially worsen the shortages to show you that this new shortage that you're dealing with, this mess, has to do with the government intervention, with the government price controls or regulation, or the government trying to compete like in a Soviet style, take over the industry and so on.
Can't you build that into your rhetoric? I mean, this is not to take lessons from Tucker Carlson, but this is one of his main tricks to say the liberals are going to tell you that I'm racist because the liberals are going to tell you that I'm this, that, and then he preempts it. And then when the audience hears it, they're like, I'm not going to believe it.
Sure. Here's where it becomes much more than just the ideology and political rhetoric, because everybody at the end of the day, whether they're policymakers or audiences listening to this stuff, they're going to move the conversation to the experts. Well, what do the experts say? In other words, professional economists, PhDs from MIT and Harvard and Chicago and Stanford. And now we're talking about an economics profession that's dominated for decades by a neoclassical, in other words, neoliberal school of thought that dominates textbooks, that dominates major economics departments, curriculum, grants, tenure, publications. And you have a dominant narrative that educates generations of professional economists into understanding that the free market is the most optimal system, that any intervention with the free market will cause disruptions, shortages, and chaos. And that's why when you ask most professional economists about price controls, they tell you, well, that doesn't work. It's a disaster. And here I'm not talking about professional economists who were conservative politically or conservative on social issues. You can get the most woke and progressive professional economist on the social front, on the political front. But when it comes to their economic thinking, the models that they use, the theories that they've been indoctrinated with for decades, that's the neoliberal mind. So the alternative economic thinking schools of thought, like MMT, Marxian, feminist, ecological economist, all of these different alternatives to the neoliberal economic model, you will not even be hired at the University of Chicago or at Stanford or MIT because your economics doesn't count, right? So this means you will not get the advising positions to the president and to the Fed and all of these strategic positions. So we have a hierarchy within the economics profession that's dominated by this neoliberal mindset. And if we had a true pluralistic kind of approach to education and the economics profession, the political landscape would be very different today because you'll have much more diversity of opinions and much more nuanced views on what the role of the government is. So here we're talking about the multi-layered complex system of control that includes politics, includes power, includes education, that is to say, the economics profession. And it cuts across everything else.
Okay. So much like that FedSoc created many generations of right-wing court jurists to fill the federal courts, they have been putting out conservative strains of economics in these departments across the country. When you said University of Chicago, I did the biggest eye roll of all time because I know that they're the root of the root, the bud of the bud. Okay, that's a longer term.
It's not unique to the University of Chicago. It's
I know, but aren't they kind of the worst?
There was a time when Harvard, when MIT, when a lot of the top universities had much more diversity of opinions. You had Keynesians, you had post-Keynesians, you had Marxists, you had people with very different framing for economic thinking, very different views on public policy. Those days are gone. Yeah. Now we have kind of a one-party system, so to speak, in politics, and one-party system in economics, and it's the neoliberal system.
Yeah, sometimes I think that liberals and their focus on what is being taught in schools and what's going on, it's not that what they focus on isn't important, but they're really missing the forest for the trees in terms of where the big battles that affect more holistic policy outcomes is, as opposed to, the interpersonal stuff, which, is important, but not the whole game. But okay, so that's happening. That's a longer term project. I don't know how we'll deal with that, table that for a second. Getting back a little bit to the specifics of price controls. Can we pick a sector and talk about how it would work, how they would be implemented, and then maybe go into how you would unwind it in a way that's less destructive than what happened in the 70s? So many of these things, it seems like, are outside of kind of domestic policy control, whether it's because it's pandemic related shortages. And again, I understand that the roots of a lot of that is the choice to offshore manufacturing, to decrease the number of storage facilities in the US for bulk storage of products and all of those kinds of things. But in the shorter term, some of that cannot be unwound. So I'm thinking of industries like the meat industry, which is about, local production. It's not something you can blame on the pandemic. I mean, I know it affected everything, but it's not something that's the supply chain issue, that the pandemic related supply chain issue. It does seem to be more one of these price gouging issues. Mm-hmm. How would you design a price control program for perhaps the meat industry or any other industry that you would want to talk about? Specifically, how would it work? You just say, okay, you can't sell a burger for more than X dollar value?
Well, you start at the source. You start with the meat production and distribution, rather than going after the final product. Because if I'm just selling burgers, I'm the final kind of step in the supply chain. But my cost of buying the burgers is more expensive. Then you're squeezing me out of business and you're forcing me into the black market or whatever. So you have to go at the source and identify where is the inflation pressure point coming when it comes to meat production. Is it the actual cost of feed for the animals? Is it the cost of labor? Is it the cost of energy to run the slaughterhouses? Is it the cost of transportation? And in many cases, it's actually quite a bit of all the above, starting primarily with the feed and cost of energy and cost of transportation. There's the issue of labor shortages, which is a different issue, because it's really an artificial labor shortage. Because when you abuse workers and underpay them during the pandemic, why would you be able to attract more workers to produce more stuff? So that's a separate issue, which can be dealt with not by spending less, not by controlling prices, but by actually regulating, having better labor regulations in terms of wages and benefits and workplace conditions and so on. But to control the price of meat, you have to identify, is this related to the shortage, the increase in energy prices? If that's the source, then you can't really blame the meat packers for the extra cost. That's just the cost of doing business. But what we're experiencing is that major producers who control the market share, like meat packers and the meat industry, they're using kind of the popular discourse about inflation all over the world. Inflation is happening and it's not us, it's the blame on the government and on spending too much. They're using that opportunity to do two things. Number one, cover their cost of doing business by raising prices because the price of inputs is higher, the price of energy, the price of the packing materials, transportation. And that's fair. Cover your cost of doing business. But they're doing a second thing, which is widening their profit margin, using the situation, using the crisis to increase the profit margin. And that's the abuse of market power. That's the part that can be regulated and should be regulated. We have things called antitrust laws, but antitrust laws have not been updated for almost a century. And antitrust laws, number one, are not effectively implemented. Number two, they're outdated. So who's responsible for upgrading antitrust laws? It's not the Fed, and it's not, the market. It's the 535 people we sent to Washington, D.C. So where are the committees who are calling for investigations on abuse of market power? Where is the Pecora investigation? Pecora investigations, which we had in the 1930s, that dealt with abuse of market power, that dealt with corruption in the corporate sector and corruption in Congress.
Yeah.
There was no way we could have had a New Deal back in the 1930s without the Pecora investigations. Same thing today. We're not going to have a fair or equitable society or a Green New Deal without a Clean New Deal, without democratizing the system. I've heard a lot of progressives and leftists the last few months increase their calls for nationalizing particular industries. I hear their pain, and I understand kind of the intuition. But before you nationalize an industry, let's first nationalize our own government. Our government is not serving the public purpose. Our government is owned and controlled by corporate interests. And if we start with that first step, have a democratically controlled system. I don't mean the Democratic Party, but a government of the people, by the people, for the people, like it was supposed to be, and have lawmakers do what they're supposed to do. They're called lawmakers. They make the laws, they regulate the system,
Yeah.
and have them do that in the interest of the public purpose. Then I guarantee you the corporate sector will be put in its place. And at that point, if we decide we still want to nationalize particular industries, we can have that conversation. But let's not jump to nationalizing industries without actually democratizing and nationalizing our own regulatory system, because then you end up with a nationalized industry that's controlled from within by corporate interest under a national label.
Yeah.
And that will be a failure of nationalization, so to speak. So we need to really understand what needs to be done in order to create these controls. So that's just an example for the meatpacking industry. You can go one sector after the other, and it's typically the same issue.
So I was going to ask you.
We can talk about the energy sector.
I was going to ask you if we should nationalize the airline industry for the next topic. So I guess you preempted that one.
Right.
But yeah, please do talk about the airline. The energy sector, because it does seem to me that you're saying the cause is the war in Ukraine, and the only out is really ending the war in Ukraine.
Not everything is related to the war in Ukraine. We have pre-existing problems in the energy sector in terms of how we regulate essentially monopolies, because when we created the national grid, the deal was to give power companies, power utilities, monopoly power over particular geographic areas at the state level, typically. And then we created public utility commissions to regulate their abuse of power, because when you're a monopoly, you can just raise prices all the time. So we have, quote unquote, a democratic system to put a check, so to speak, on their power. But let's talk about those public utility commissions and how corrupt in some cases those entities are. If you've paid attention to the scandal in the state of Ohio over the last year, with bribes at the tune of $65 million and several arrests by the FBI, including the Speaker of the House and people involved in the Public Utility Commission. So there is corruption. And Ohio is sort of unique in the sense that it was so obvious that the FBI was able to essentially detect these problems immediately, but it cuts across the system. And then we created an incentive system for public utilities that says you can only raise prices under certain conditions that we can justify. And that is creating an incentive for public utilities to increase their investment infrastructure, sometimes in areas that don't really lower the cost or improve the long run viability of a resilient grid, because they can then use the additional cost that they put on the table to pass it on to consumers. So it became a system whereby the only way to increase, or one of the favorite ways of increasing your profits, your quarterly profits, is by spending more and passing on those bills to consumers. So we have a failed system, and now we have a compiled effect with the most profitable way for utilities to spend and pass on the cost is not to spend on renewables, but to spend on fossil fuel infrastructure, more stranded assets. In other words, we have to figure out a way to create a new regulatory infrastructure at the federal and at the state level in order to decarbonize the system, in order to democratize the system. Public utilities need to understand that this new world of renewable energy and climate change, their role is going to change from being a monopoly that produces and distributes and prices and maintains the grid, to a decentralized system that's actually more resilient from a climate perspective and lower cost for consumers, and they play the role now of maintenance and management of the grid, of the load on the grid, which is a whole other profession that is
Kaboub,
new to most of them.
if I could vote for you for president, I would feel a lot more assured. Or another candidate who would pick you as an economic advisor, I would be like, this would be a very optimistic conversation.
Sure.
That not being the case, being the case that President Biden is the president of the United States of America. And he recently said in a speech when asked, do you think you're the best president to meet the desires of the progressive part of your party? Responded saying, well, of course I'm the best. I'm the only option they have. I'm the president of the United States of America.
Yeah.
Your views on abortion have evolved in your public life. Are you the best messenger to carry this forward when Democrats, many of them, many progressives, want you to do more?
Yeah, I am. I'm the president of the United States of America. That makes me the best messenger.
That being the case, so I'm like listening to you talk and I'm listening to you make all of the sense. But the gap between what you're saying and what feels at all politically viable absent an actual left insurrection is making me, is like setting my teeth on edge. We live in a world, like I sit at Rising Now 3 days a week, and I have these conversations with my libertarian co-host. And when the problems with the system come up that you've just described, all of the corruption, et cetera, his commentary is obviously, well, this is why we shouldn't have government. It never works. It shouldn't work. You were better off with the free market, which I don't have to explain to anybody listening to this why that's not my take. However, there is something that feels insurmountable to it. And I think on some level, you do have to address the concerns of a lot of Americans who are perhaps less ideological compared to my co-host, but who are still skeptical that, you know, with all of the problems that are in the government, with all of the corruption that happens, with all of the ways that government can be co-opted, why would you want to confer it more power? Even your point about not wanting to nationalize until you can figure that problem out.
Yeah, and that's why most of my effort personally is not to kind of push existing power structures into doing policy X or policy Y or policy Z. Most of my effort as an educator is in educating the public, empowering people with an alternative narrative and mobilizing people, because that's how you democratize the system. When your constituents can call your bluff and provide an alternative narrative. And one of the things that we have to learn from the right is how Reagan in the US and Thatcher in the UK really changed the world in the 1970s for the worst, in my view. They didn't shift the public discourse from sort of a welfare state type of model to a neoliberal model by winning academic debates in professional academic journals. As a matter of fact, their economists lost all those debates in the 1960s. But here's how they changed the world. They had a compelling narrative. They were brilliant communicators. They went to the public and said, we feel your pain, and we know how to deal with it, and we know who's to blame. Similarly, Trump did the same, by the way, in 2016 when he came to the deindustrialized Midwest, and Bernie did the same, by the way. They both pinched a nerve in this part of the country. They said, number one, we feel your pain. We know that the establishment Democrats and Republicans lied to you, threw you under the bus, neglected you, took away your jobs. And of course, Trump had his narrative. And he said, well, I'm going to build a wall. I'm going to go after XYZ. And of course, fired up a lot of people on the right. And Bernie, of course, had his narrative in terms of how do we deal with that, the Green New Deal and job creation and higher wages and healthcare. All of those issues, that nerve that they pinched in 2015, 2016 is still raw here. And this is how you change the system, by mobilizing people with a coherent narrative, not just on the political front, on the emotional front, but you have to have a coherent narrative on the economic front. And once you have those masses and you have your coherent policy strategy, you can change the system. But for an individual to change the system from the top without the underlying support, it's not going to work.
That's what's so frustrating, is that there isn't a Democratic Party that is willing to even make these arguments. Even if you can't get Congress behind them, even if Biden couldn't pass anything, let's just pretend he was completely powerless and it was all rhetorical. We don't even have a Democratic Party who is willing to make the case for why more spending in this moment is necessary. They got their COVID spending package, did their little thing, and then immediately started acting ashamed of it, even when it was popular.
Yeah.
Even when they didn't double down and cheer on their successes. Democrats are seemingly embarrassed of the fact that they're Democrats.
Yeah, we didn't. The problem is that we had enough grassroots supports from the grassroots, but not enough to overwhelm the Democratic Party and actually vote people out of office. And that is still the challenge. We had enough of a big push with the Bernie movement, but it wasn't enough to overwhelm the system. And that's why they resort to keeping the status quo. And you have to acknowledge that in Congress, people in Congress, representatives, lots of the names that you don't hear about at the national level. I call them sort of followers. And they're really the interesting group right now because they're looking to the right and to the left of the party. They're saying they're seeing the Bernie and AUC and kind of the squad movement setting people on fire, so to speak, in terms of mobilizing grassroots of the party. And they're looking at the right of the party and saying the power, the money, the influence, the Nancy Pelosi control of the system. And they're trying to decide, which way do I go? Do I stick with the establishment because it's still powerful? Or do I look forward to the future and see this new wave of progressive energy that's going to overtake the party? And we're not at that tipping point yet, where you see troves of those representatives giving up the establishment and joining the popular progressive movement.
And why would they, when mainstream Democrats are giving so much cover to the status quo approach to the economy? There's so much vulnerability, in doing so. So I wanna get to just one more topic, but first I gotta close the loop on. I just want to ask you, like, quick and dirty. Would you support price controls? And wait a minute, before we even get there, Nixon talks about price and wage controls. And the wage control part sits more uneasily with me just as a progressive than the price control part. But as I've read, these things, go together. Can you explain that and why I shouldn't have hesitation around the idea of wage controls?
Well, because it's anti-labor.
So I should have hesitation around wage controls.
Yeah, absolutely. And the focus of the Nixon, most of the pressure of the Nixon administration was on the wage level, not so much on the price level.
Right.
And that's really
I've heard people say that that's why it went wrong. Exactly. But is it necessary to have some wage controls if you're going to do price controls?
No, not necessarily. Not necessarily. If anything, in our situation today, wages have not been able to keep up with inflation, with the cost of living. So why would you want to control wages at this point in time when people can barely afford rent, can barely afford? If anything, we need one way to deal with the existing inflation that's coming out of Russia and the Ukraine and the global disruption is not by squeezing workers into poverty and into unemployment, is actually by supporting workers so they can cover the cost of living during this crisis. Instead, we're throwing workers under the bus. We're throwing the middle class, the working class under the bus in the name of controlling inflation. That's the price control that we have right now.
Let me ask you this, though. Is it the case that if people got higher salaries, that it would put more stress on the demand and the supply crisis? Are you going to see an inflationary effect unless you do some of the other, antitrust or addressing price gouging or actually creating more supply because you're ending the war or things like that?
That's why you have to do all the above. But squeezing wages and workers, throwing them under the bus as the only solution to inflation is the problem. Mm-hmm. And people who say we don't like price controls, by the way, we do have price controls. Right now, it's by corporations, right? It's the abusive market. That is a form of price control. The price control that the Fed uses is by throwing millions of people into unemployment to fight inflation. That's the price control system they use. And we're saying that's not the best way for a democratic society, the most effective way for the richest country in the world to throw millions of people into poverty and unemployment and neglect. in the name of protecting the status quo of corporate power and abuse, and protecting the established power structures within corporate America and at the global level as well.
So what's the trick then for unwinding it? Let's say hypothetically, Joe Biden had a change of heart, implemented price controls, actually supported a living wage, et cetera, and we go into a period of stability. When it's over, let's say 2 years from now, what is the trick for not having some of the negative effects that happened in the 1970s at the end of Nixon's price controls?
Well, one of the things that will happen on the corporate side as soon as you put price controls is that corporations will actually slow down production. Because it becomes not profitable enough for them to build more infrastructure and produce more stuff.
Nationalize.
So they will create, well, exactly. They will create the shortages. And once you have shortages, you build up a long, and a very strong pent-up demand. And as soon as you remove the restrictions, the supply side is not going to keep up with the new demand. So these are the problems that you create when you introduce price controls in a very narrow way without actually having a clear understanding of what creates the pressure in the price system.
But help me understand this, because it seems to me that if you're a manufacturer who decides to slow down production because it's no longer so profitable for you, fine. Is there no communication between government and manufacturers to say, okay, we're about to lift these. We anticipate demand being this. You want to profit. You've been clamoring to profit more. Shouldn't the invisible hand of the market dictate that those manufacturers are primed and ready to increase manufacturing for that moment so that there aren't those kind of lags?
So we did have that during World War II. We created an administration called the OPA, the Office of Price Administration. And it did have corporate employees in the private sector who were managers of the production system and managers of the price system who, because of the patriotic mood of World War II, even though they were employed in the private sector, they were patriotic to the federal government's demand for price controls, and they did not attempt to slow down production artificially in order to hurt the national effort. So that was pretty successful at that time. The only place during that World War II price control and rationing system where we had sort of a hiccup was in the meat production industry, because it wasn't as controlled and centralized, and it wasn't it didn't because it touched really people's daily lives when you ration how much meat you can eat, and especially in rural areas, and that was politically not successful and economically not successful, and created a lot of pent-up demand in that sector when we released the price controls. But on the manufacturing side, we had a pretty successful effort because we had individuals within the corporate sectors who were more loyal to the national effort than to shareholders and owners of capital. And that was unique to that moment. I don't know how we can recreate that, or if we can recreate that, but that's part of the success of the World War II effort, was due to a national commitment to dealing with the national priority, which is winning World War II and dealing with the shortages of inputs, because most of the inputs were dedicated to producing tanks and airplanes and military equipment rather than consumer goods. And we had across the board effort to control demand, because when we paid workers decent wages to build military equipment for the war effort, we paid them decent wages, but they didn't have the consumer goods to buy. So they could have, gone out on a shopping spree and caused massive inflation. But instead, we had the US Treasury offer them an opportunity to postpone their consumption and be paid for it. And that's what we call war bonds or freedom bonds. So you take your income, you buy US Treasuries. In other words, you put your money in a savings account that pays you back after the war plus interest. So again, we leverage the patriotic mood of the nation to postpone consumption. Some people call it forced savings, but it was really voluntary. People didn't have an option. There were no new homes to buy. There were no new cars to buy. And the Treasury was offering you a great opportunity, guaranteed to save your money and be paid an interest. And of course, it was marketed as this is your way of contributing to the war effort. So when you deal with inflation pressure points and shortages, you have to deal with them across the board, like we did during World War II. The good news is that we don't have to go to the extreme sort of measures that we had to do during World War II, like rationing of key things and slowing down the speed limit to save rubber because we had a rubber shortage during. We don't have to go that far. Much more tame intervention, but the regulatory infrastructure that we have today is much weaker and much more controlled and dictated by corporate interest than what we had even in the 1970s, but especially compared to what we had in World War II. So that's the failure of the system, is when we've lost the regulatory influence of the federal government, thanks to 4 decades of neoliberal influence and control and deregulation. That's where the strategic weakness is. And now this is a wake-up call for us to recognize that there's a role for the government to play. And it's not just by jumping and controlling prices, but first starting with its own regulatory infrastructure and introducing regulatory systems that will force the corporate sector to be more competitive, to not price gouge and not dominate and abuse the system.
So is there anything, again, I'm sorry to have electoral brain, but is there anything that Biden can do or should do in the shorter term before midterms?
Oh, you're talking about midterms.
Yeah.
I think that's I'm not going to be the optimistic voice in this conversation today. To be realistic, I mean, what Biden has done and can do, it doesn't seem like he's willing to really ruffle the feathers, so to speak.
Yeah.
When it comes to, introducing some regulations and some strategic intervention to deal with inflation, he has gone for the kind of the lowest hanging fruit with the minimum disruption to the system. That is to say, putting money on the table to increase the logistical capabilities of ports to unclog the supply chains. Well, that's helpful, but you didn't go after the abusive market power of price setters in the system. You didn't regulate, you didn't intervene on regulating labor standards for truck drivers, for example. So because that's more disruptive. In the last month or so, the federal government is finally going after global shipping companies. We have 9 shipping companies that took advantage of the pandemic and raised the cost of shipping from, say, $2,000 a piece for a container coming from China to up to $20,000, $30,000 a piece. Jesus. For no good reason. It's not because of energy prices or labor shortages. Those are excuses. So he's going after kind of the weakest links in the system who can't push back. But is he going to go after the big dogs, so to speak, in the system? I don't think so. I don't think he has the political courage or capital or will to do that. And he said it during the election cycle leading up to his presidency. And it's been his attitude as a senator for the last, 30, 40 years. So why would it be any different in the next few months leading up to November? So we have to be realistic. Even FDR, if you want to really concentrate the power of change in the hands of the president, FDR is well known for saying, to grassroots movements and the progressive voices, I agree with you. Now make me do it.
Yeah. Well, but that's what I'm trying to get at, though. If we were to want to make him do something, I don't even know what to ask him to do. And so what I'm asking is not what you think pragmatically he's going to do, but what you would do in that situation, what the demand should be.
Well, one of the first things you want to do on the economic front is start with understanding the price system so that you know where you kind of direct your anger and your force and your regulation. So start with this small army of economists and statisticians that we have in Washington, D.C., which is CBO, the Congressional Budget Office. And, most people know the CBO for telling Congress, this is how much the deficit will increase if you spend this much. Well, that's really not useful information. That small army of economists, you can ask them to detect the actual inflation pressure points. Which are the industries? Look at the inflation statistics, the consumer price index, and identify where the inflation pressure points are coming from from a micro perspective, detect the abusive market power that we have in the system and provide Congress, provide the president with that information so we know exactly where to go.
Okay.
And once you identify that, you realize that to deal with the inflation pressure point in a particular industry, you have to increase productive capacity. If the private sector is not willing to do it, then at that point, you go and either nationalize or add kind of publicly owned and publicly directed investments, strategic investments, like we did during World War II. Did we ask the market during World War II to produce military equipment for us? No, we didn't. We took over the city of Detroit and we shut down manufacturing of cars and we produced military equipment because that was the national priority, right? What are our national priorities today? Is our national priority to protect the corporate interest and the price gougers? If that's
Yes.
what it is, then of course we should wait for inflation to disappear somehow after a few years. But if we want to go after the source of inflation, we have to understand where it's coming from and then be able to call their bluff and push for an alternative narrative. And once you kind of expose this to the public, you'll have the forces, the grassroots forces on the right and on the left that will support a presidential decree, so to speak, and federal government action to go after it. But calling them price gougers in the vague without having evidence other than a corporate phone call where CEOs are saying, well, the pricing environment is favorable, so our profits are higher this quarter. Well, that's a starting point, but it doesn't get us into the weeds and the details of how the system works.
Yeah, it doesn't. I mean, I had a friend say we should be PCORA commissioning and not 1/6 commissioning, a hearing, and I'm not saying it's even mutually exclusive, but it does really cast a bad light on our national priorities here. Look, I've kept you for almost, about an hour already, but quickly, could I ask you to opine on the little controversy that's emerging around Bernie's policy suggestions for how to address these delays that have been going on with airlines for folks that, have not been following. Bernie Sanders and John Fetterman both are calling on Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg to levy fines on airlines who cancel flights they knowingly understaffed. The strategy is to enact some pretty significant fines. For example, $15,000 a passenger for non-weather flight delays over 2 hours, fines of $55,000 a passenger for flight cancellations that cannot be fully staffed, full refunds for delays between 1 and 4 hours, plus meals and lodging for 4-hour plus delays. Some people have said this seems draconian. Those fines seem too big. What do you make of how these fines have been tailored in this plan overall?
Sure. So the situation that we have with the airlines today really represents two sort of failures. One is a long-term failure, which is the deregulation of the airline industry and allowing them essentially to do as they please, not just with consumers, but also with their workers, with their employees that they treat as disposables. And when the pandemic hit, even though we had massive bailout of the airline industry, close to $50 or $54 billion total for the biggest airlines in the country, they still went on a retirement spree, forcing pilots into retirement, as if the pandemic, their vision was like the pandemic is going to last for the next 100 years, so we don't need all these pilots.
So a condition of the money was that they not fire people, but they just used like forced retirements as a workaround.
As a workaround, exactly. So of course, 2 years later, we have a shortage, and you can't just snap your fingers and produce pilots. You have to train them. You have to give them months and months of flying experience before you put them on an airplane to handle people's lives essentially and safety. So that's a failure of the industry, but it's primarily a failure of the government in terms of its intervention. Many of us in the progressive movement, in the MMT community, you've probably heard Stephanie Kelton say this from day one of the pandemic. What we need to do is nationalize the payroll. In other words, put everybody who's now on the payroll completely funded during the pandemics to stay safely and so on. But we didn't do that. We gave them money with no strings attached, so to speak, and we didn't carefully regulate that. In terms of the fines, are these draconian? I don't see them as draconian because in the past we've had massive fines on airlines that used to, keep passengers on the tarmac for hours. And as soon as those draconian fines were introduced, we're talking literally in matters of days, the length of time wasted on the tarmac decreased by 98%. So So what
Wow,
I
it's like
call
they
these
can do it. That's the point. Like the
these
fines only seem
exactly
extreme if you don't think that they can do it. These aren't weather delay fines. These
exactly.
are they choose to understaff, book you, and waste your time anyway, and have you sitting in that airport because they know there's no consequences.
Right, exactly. And it's really, I mean, the bottom line for these airlines is the profit margin is what shareholders are demanding. It's not like the money that they're making is going to the staff, the crew, or the pilots or the technicians. We know what the power structure is within the airline industry, within corporate America in general. So the way I see these fines that Bernie Sanders is talking about is incentive to do the right thing, as opposed to the current system, which is incentive to throw people under the bus, their consumers and their workers as well, that they treat as disposable, as opposed to treating their workers as a source of really the source of wealth that for
Yeah.
the industry.
And what do you say to folks who argue they'll just pass those costs off to consumers?
Well, that's where we have regulations, right? So regulations is not just about imposing fines and allowing them to pass it on to consumers. We've lost the battle, decades ago in terms of regulating how airlines pass on the cost of doing business to consumers, and how they pass on not just the cost of doing business, but widen the profit margins because they can. And that has to do with fuel, for example. We know that oil prices go up and down over the decades, and every time there's an increase in oil prices and the time is right, they add a fuel surcharge. But then when oil prices come down and fuel prices come down, they don't remove that fuel surcharge. It becomes sort of part of your cost of doing business. So they use that, and that becomes their incentive to widen their profit margins and not pass it on to their workers, not pass it on to the pilots or flight crews, but pass that on to shareholders. So this is how you create the 1% over 4 or 5 decades of corporate abuse, deregulation, and the federal government acting as if there is very little they can do other than tweet about it or complain about it on TV.
Is it really possible for regulation to prevent? I mean, they obviously they find their workarounds. They found their don't fire employees workaround. Is it really? I mean, what kind of regulations can prevent them from coming up with some plausible excuse to at least pass on some of those costs?
Stock buybacks, for example. Look at what the airlines, the major airlines, have done in the last decades. Major stock buybacks. So they have windfall profits that they use to fuel stock prices. And who benefits from higher stock prices? It's the shareholders, and it's the top executives. So there was a time in this country where stock buybacks by corporations was illegal, because it's a ruse to fuel a stock market bubble to the advantage of a handful of individuals, the top 1%, the shareholders. So just that one policy change can move us in the right direction.
But so, for example, I was wondering if perhaps the fines were so big, $55,000 a passenger, so big, because at a certain point, you have to absorb the cost, because if you were to pass on $55,000 a passenger worth to the passengers, no one's buying a ticket. At a certain point, everyone's like, okay, well, I just literally cannot afford to fly.
Yeah.
And if that was part of why the fines were calculated, set so high.
No, they're set so high because we know that airlines can do this. They're intentionally understaffing and selling tickets to customers, knowing well that they're going to have to cancel the flight because they're understaffed. So this is beyond abuse of power. This is abusing consumers, and we're talking about transportation, which should be viewed as a public utility, just like producing electricity, just like public health. We can't have a functioning economy, functioning society today without transportation. And having the transportation system be deregulated to the point of abuse, daily abuse, by all major airlines is just unacceptable.
Right. I guess I am still a little unclear about what mechanism prevents them from raising prices. I guess I don't quite understand how stock buybacks would prevent them from, or making stock buybacks illegal, even though it would obviously hurt their ability, profit margins, how that prevents them from still trying to extract more from consumers.
So Bernie, for example, talked about a windfall tax on excessive profits, right? So if you have excessive profits, this means that you're either not distributing those profits to shareholders or not distributing those to your workers or their pensions or investing in infrastructure that will actually lower the cost of doing business. So this creates an incentive for airlines to move into a situation where they don't actually have to have these excessive profits so that they don't have to pay this excessive tax and instead use their revenues to distribute in a better way to either consumers in terms of lower cost or to their workers in terms of better wages and benefits and workplace conditions. And that will be a win-win for everybody.
So I see the options then, if you can't have profit over a certain point, is either pay your workers better or lower prices to at least draw more, like compete better against other airlines, I guess.
Exactly. Or pay the tax.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. I'm sold. Excellent. I'm in.
Wonderful.
Thank you so much, Professor. I really appreciate you coming to explain to little old hard-headed me about these concepts. Can you tell people where they can find you more regularly, both on podcasts and on the internet?
Well, thank you again for the opportunity and for this wonderful conversation. You can find me. I teach economics at Denison University, and I'm the president of the Global Institute for Sustainable Prosperity. You can find me on Twitter, on LinkedIn, and a shout out to a lot of the other podcasts in the MMT community, the MMT podcast, Macro and Cheese, Money on the Left, and so many others that I'm forgetting right now. But find us on social media. The goal really is to educate, mobilize, organize for change. And it starts with empowering people with an alternative narrative. And that narrative has to have kind of a coherent economic policy framework. And we're hoping to build that narrative together. Thank you again for the opportunity.
Thank you. Thank you for the work that you do. Thank you to all the listeners for subscribing. As always, keep the faith. Hey, YouTube. Thanks for watching. Just a reminder that this is a podcast. You can catch an extra premium episode every Monday for $5 a month at patreon.com/badfaithpodcast. That's patreon.com/badfaithpodcast for $5 a month, an extra episode every week. Additionally, please do consider liking this video, subscribing to this channel. It helps us out. It helps independent media beat the algorithm. We appreciate you. And as always, keep the faith.